Allô, allô, allô. Allô, 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 allô. Allô, 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 allô. Allô, allô, allô. Allô, 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 allô.
012, 012, 012. Un chicken le niveau parce que sur la voie un peu bas. Ouais. 012, 012, 012.
C'est bon. Dernière conférence de la journée qui va nous être présentée par Pedro sous le titre de Oralité et écologie en Marc 4, 3 à 9. Ce sera en anglais. À vous la parole, Pedro.
So good afternoon. So orality and ecology in Mark 4, 3 to 9. To communicate the message concerning the kingdom of the Father, Jesus successfully made use of imagery taken from the natural world to tell his audience that there is a similarity between the divine work of the kingdom and that of the process of nature, that God is active in both. This truth may even be clear today, but it does not automatically draw the faithful to respect, love, and preserve nature. Biblical texts are studied from various points of view, aiming at uncovering their message for life in the current global crisis. However, I realize that little has been done on how to transmit persuasively the message of the biblical text on the care of creation. To fill this gap, I deem it necessary to deepen the rhetoricalness, that is, the persuasive strategies embedded in Mark 4, 3 to 9, by looking at the orality and the ecological elements in the text. Then I try to see from the African context, from the Makua tribe rhetoric, that is my tribe from Mozambique, some persuasive strategies that could render the message on the ecology persuasive to today's Makua audience. I take Mark 4, 1 to 9 as an echo parable that employs elements from nature in a persuasive manner, which, if combined with African strategies of persuasion, could lead Makua audiences and others to feel persuaded to adopt an eco-friendly life that is imbued with an ecological sensitivity. In my view, deepening God's message on ecology from biblical texts has to go hand in hand with discovering the means for its persuasive transmission. I proceed as follows. In the first part, I study the text from the oral point of view with reference to ecological and rhetorical elements embedded in the text. In the second part, I study a Makua oral story related to ecology with reference to its persuading power. And in the third part, the application, I attempt an application of some elements of Makua's story to the biblical text for a persuasive transmission of its ecological message. Then the first part, the orality and ecological aspects of the biblical text. I'm aware that orality is a controversial and a broad term, and then I stick to the Latin etymology, os, oris, mouth, and I take it as designating all the dynamics of the word of the mouth. Then I don't take it only limited to the word of the mouth, but I take it in a broad manner that it designates all the dynamics of the word of the mouth, that is, the speaking, the listening, the performance, and the nonverbal communication. Concerning the marks of orality or the features of orality, I adopt Actmeyer's definition in his article Omne Verbum Sonat, that verbal clues that by being heard, not seen, would have aided the listener in understanding the organization of the kind of complex writings that are found in the New Testament. And I'm also aware that oral biblical critics are divided on how to categorize the features of orality in a written text, and I adopt the categorization proposed by Wendland, who says, for example, who gives the following examples: recurrent motifs, use of interjection, presence of parataxis, use of mnemonics, the presence of same-sounding words, and emphasis. So, and in this text, concerning the orality of the text, I will point the following features of oral text. Hearing motive. Chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel has been considered by some scholars as characterized by hearing paradigm. This pericope under study begins and ends with a hearing motif, akuete, listen, in verse 3, and then ota, ears, akuein, and akueto in verse 9. It is worth of note that the fact that in Mark's Gospel the verb akuo occurs 44 times, and it is only in our pericope that the imperative akuete, listen, is employed without direct object, because in fact the direct object of the imperative here is supposed to be the whole story, the whole parable, what follows. Another feature of orality that I would like to point out is interjection. Although idu, we found in this text, idu is formally a second person singular aorist imperative of the verb to see, it is used in that way only in a few times in the New Testament. Most of its New Testament occurrences represent idu, the intercession particle, rather than idu, the imperative verb. In communities accustomed to oral communication, these interjection nuances an oral narrative reduced to writing. Interesting also is the fact that it is placed after akuo, to listen. And then this does not mean to see with the eyes, but to calmly imagine. In fact, it is used here to heighten the appeal to listening. Then another feature of orality is the parataxis. In our pericope, except in verses 3 and 9, respectively, the opening and closing verses of our pericope, all the other verses are introduced by paratactical kai, kai egeneto, kai elthen, kai katefage, kai alo, kai euthus. Then from the grammatical point of view, the use of kai in our pericope is simply to provide the audience with a plot line connecting events and providing cohesion to the story as a whole. And also it functions in this pericope under study as an oral structuring element in order to appeal to the ear and help the listener join the various events in the parable. Then I would also point out to mnemonics. Kelber says that parables are mnemonically shaped to facilitate speaking and hearing. And then we have mnemonic patterning here as an imprint of orality. As a matter of fact, the parable shows a sharp contrast between triple failure along the path, rocky places, thorny soil, and triple success of the seed, multiplying 30, 60, and 100 times. This contrast renders the story under study orally impressionable for the display of opposites in order to hold the attention of the audience. And then we have also same sounding words. Commenting on reception of ancient texts, Horsley affirms that how a text was received depended not only on what was said, but also on the sounds employed to say it. In our parable, we identify, I would point out the alliteration, that is a repetition of some sounding syllables in the opening of the parable. For example, speron, sperai, or alpha, that lengthens the sound in verse 4, ta, petena, kai, katef again, auto, aiming at stressing the unhappy outcome of the first sowing. Then I also identify the repetition of kappa consonant, kai, karpon, uk, etoken, no? And it yielded no fruit in verse 7. These same sounding words here are meant to highlight the words and dissuade the audience from being like the three bad souls. Then we could also look at the ecology in the text, the use of, in this paper, by ecology I mean the words, concepts, ideas, expressions, mindset, worldview related to natural world. Then we have the sower, speiron, we have speirai, hodon, rod, petena, birds, we have petrodes, stony, we have gain, sand, and so on and so forth. These elements are related to humans, to animals, to the universe, and there is no hierarchy among the created elements. This is a very important also to note. He or she, the listener, has to stick to the persuasive power of the imagery taken from nature here. The rhetoricalness of the ecological elements does not reside in their grammatical or synthetical role in the parable, but in the imagery which they are intended to display in the mind of the listeners. In fact, parables dealing with natural processes address the listener's feeling for the natural world. And then in the second part, after dealing with the orality and with the ecology, I deal with a story, a Makua story from Mozambique, that I would like to read it. The translation I have there, I have made from the Makua. Once upon a time, an old man said to a group of young men, "You young men, be wise. It's not enough to be initiated. Be wise. Fear God and the spirits of our ancestors, and show respect for our rivers and our forests and our mountains and the animals that live on there. And listen to your elders. Corn gets ready to harvest while still attached to the maize plant." This is a proverb. "Allow me to tell you the following story. There was a young man like you many years ago, before your fathers were born. One afternoon, the young man went to bath in a river and got the disease of acne, because the river and all that lived in it hated him. The following day, he went to a mountain to hunt wild rabbits. And when he reached there, it began to rain heavily, and he could not hunt the rabbits, because the mountain and the wild rabbits hated him. Then he went to a forest nearby to fetch some firewood. But when he reached there, the strong whirlwind started to blow, and he could not cut the firewood, because the forest and all the animals hated him. The next day he went to his field to sow peanuts. He saw the peanuts and went back home. But a friend of his came to tell him that all the peanuts had been eaten up by rats and birds, and he did not harvest anything that year, because, you see, his own field, the rats and the birds hated him. Open your ears and be wise, young men. Otherwise, God, the spirits and our ancestors, the waters, animals, and plants will be against us all, and we will be swallowed, our roots and our fruits." So this is, in fact, the Makua story, I recorded it from an elder, and then I tried to analyze it. I translated it into English and tried to analyze to see the employment of vocabulary from nature, the rivers, corn, forests, animals, wild rabbits, and so on. And then I realized that these elements from nature employed try to force, in a way, the listener to revisit his experience with nature and possibly embrace an ecological worldview. In revisiting those experiences with nature, he or she is more likely to feel called to relate it harmoniously to it than if those experiences were, for example, with humans. And then we have a use of a proverb in this Makua text, and we have repetitions also of expressions and themes for rhetorical effect. We have, for example, the presence of God and the ancestors in order to give more authority to the message. We have the use of metaphors also from nature. We have the use of non-verbal communication. When I recorded the elder, the old man, he used non-verbal communications, he used gestures in order also to heighten the importance of what he was saying. Then some fear-inducing figures, spirits, ancestors that are used here. So all these, then in my paper, I see that there is, it's possible to have a dialogue between Mark 4:3-9 with this Makua story that is also an echo story, I will call it. That took me to re-oralize the text, basing on what I have found in the text of Mark, the oral elements and the elements from nature, from Mark, and basing on what I have found from Makua text, its orality and its ecology, or the orality and the ecology of the Makua text, and then I try to re-oralize the Mark 4:3-9 in order to make it more persuasive. What have I done? I inserted attention-grabbing words from Makua context. I inserted into the parable from Mark, and then loudness. I suggest some loudness in some verses that you will see in my paper, and we find, because now I don't have time to display, but I suggest loudness in some parts of the text. I suggest silence. I inserted silence between the third and fourth type of soil in order to help the hearer make a transition between the positive and negative outcome of the seed. I inserted gesture for the expression. For example, anyone who has ears to hear should hear. Now, at the end of the parable. Then a rhetorical translation of the text, especially emphasizing the verses that deal with the nature, the ecological elements. Then I would end with I end my paper with a proposal of what I call eco-rhetorical preaching. Eco-rhetorical preaching. I mean a preaching that, based on a biblical text, uses elements from the natural world in a persuasive manner in order to enhance love and care towards creation. In my view, Mark 4:3-9 is a model for eco-rhetorical preaching today, which appears to me urgent and indispensable in the current ecological crisis, where it seems the appeals made by Pope Francis, theologians, governments, and civil society organizations are not reaching the heart of the people. So perhaps eco-rhetorical preaching could appeal to the ear of the audience. And then I suggest some steps. For example, just I will read it. For example, the first step that could be useful also for biblical apostolate, reading many times the biblical text and identifying the theme, and then considering in the second step, considering the rhetoricalness embedded in the oral features of the biblical text, the metaphors, proverbs, repetitions, and then looking at the ecological elements present in the text, as I did, and then finding in the local culture oral strategies of persuasion. Local culture, I mean traditional and also modern or new cultures of today that could help highlight the importance of the ecological message today. And then taking into consideration the above points, one could attempt a persuasive translation of those words, expressions, or verses which are related to the eco elements in the biblical text. And then finally, one could preach the biblical theme using both the persuasiveness of the biblical text and the local strategies of persuasion. This could be, according to me, adopted by all Christian preachers. I think it would be a very good contribution of Christianity and to this global crisis today. So I think, in fact, my thesis here is that our contribution is not only on concerning what the biblical text says concerning ecology or concerning nature, but on how the biblical text says it. Not only the thing that is said, but how it is said. Anyway, I would have some other things here to underline, but I think this is enough, yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Pedro, pour votre exposé. J'invite votre première lectrice à prendre place pour donner appréciation et évaluation.
Thank you very much, Father Jose Joaquin Pedro, for your paper, Orality and Ecology in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, verses 3 to 9. The study is interesting. I found it original and mind-seeking and engaging with the thought of the author in order to see how we can relate the gospel text or the scriptural text with our stories and orality. This study has captured the text reading in the context of Mukua people of Mozambique narratology. It has examined the similarities of Makua people of Mozambique natural elements with those natural elements or ecological texts or words that the author has derived from Mark chapter 4, verses 4 to 8. Second, the author has used PACE recommended methodology of contextualization, deconstruction, and reconstruction. Additionally, the author has applied rhetoricalness approach or persuasive strategies embedded in the reading of the text by reading the text between the lines in order to draw out what the author calls eco-rhetoric parable in Mark chapter 4, verses 3 to 9. The author has drawn out Mark 4, 3 to 9, what he terms ecological in the text by drawing out the ecological words: sower, birds, to sow, stony, sand, sun, roots, thorns, and fruits. he has identified repetitions in the text and shown how many times Semitic kai is used in the text. Number 3, the author uses oral transmission to illustrate the orality in the text by pointing out to vocabulary from nature, although ecology is not the main theme in Mark chapter 4, verses 3 to 9, as we would agree that Jesus is using this parable to illustrate a different theme. The author explains that he uses the oral transmission to make the listener revisit his or her experience with nature and embrace ecological worldview. In revisiting those experiences with nature within the text, the author assumes that the reader will be called to harmoniously relate with the experience in the story. In this regard, I find the author trying to bend the text too much in order for him to read the text from ecology and rhetoricness of the text. Fourth, the author analyzes the similarities of the lessons in both the parable, Mark chapter 4, verses 3 to 9, and the Makua people of Mozambique, by which he points out the importance of the elements in both narratives and the lessons they teach by re-oralization of the text. That is a new insight in this study and is a commendation for the insight that the author uses. 5, the author suggests that one of the ways to use eco-rhetorical study of text is for preaching, so that the Bible text or pericope may touch the hearts of the audience, particularly in relationship to what is familiar to the people and within the context of the people, realizing that when you use a particular story of the people, the message becomes more alive and real. And that, I think, is another way that the author is reaching out within this text. The author can promote the study of Scripture and can be used as rightly to say for preaching, as he indicated, that is reconstruction. 7th, the method can enhance, reinforce, and reinforce the use of social media to persuade the audience when preaching. This is a 21st century approach to preaching and can be very effective in preaching. But I think by using the real life story of the people brings the scripture text closer to the hearts of the people. I have a concern about the approach by which the author tries to bend the text in order to fit the methodology in which he has presented. That is rhetorical and persuasive, and maybe the author has, maybe he can further explain to us this bending the text that I found very, very close to the study that he presents. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Sœur Aringo, pour vos observations, pour votre rapport. La parole est à vous, Pedro. Quelle est votre réaction face à ces observations?
In fact, though we cannot isolate theme and means of transmission, of communication of the same theme, we cannot do it because theme goes together with how the means of transmission or the means of communication, what I call here strategies of persuasion. They go together with the theme itself. But I didn't mind so much for my studies. I didn't consider it relevant here, the theme. I know that the theme is the kingdom of God, it's not ecology. But the fact that Jesus uses metaphors from, he chooses to use metaphors from nature. He could have used metaphors from somewhere else. That means he wants really the listener to revisit it, as I pointed it out, to revisit the experience he or she has with nature. So I don't think I'm forcing the methodology. I'm really saying that we could, in fact, what the steps I propose at the end, I think one can use it for any eco-related text or eco-biblical text. It would be, I think, would be interesting to try it out. It's just an hypothesis, but I will try it out to see. Yeah. But I'm not really forcing the methodology. I think it fits very well. Yeah.
Merci beaucoup, Pedro. Maintenant, la parole est donnée au public. Alors, 1, 2, 3, 4, c'est bon.
Joachim, thank you very much for that very clear exposition. And as you might guess, my question goes to the fact that you clearly used a rhetorical approach, and I saw that you tried to show the rhetorical link between the biblical text from Mark and the Makua culture. I think that was very nicely done. I would like to congratulate you for that. Now, my question would be, beyond the question of the rhetorical approach, the rhetorical things, this is a text in Mark which is being clearly appropriated to teach a religious lesson. Do you find, or could you say a similar thing about the story which you heard from the sage, from the wise man that you interviewed? Are these stories also appropriated for similar reasons? Do they carry a sacral dimension, or does it remain only at the maybe educational parabolic level?
Yes, there are similarities. In fact,
Next, Moïse, oui. Vous avez une question?
Listening to you and reading the paper, I realized that you interpreted more the Mozambican story than the biblical text in terms of balance and approach. So what does that mean? Thank you.
Akotia, vous aviez levé la main ici devant.
Je n'ai pas bien saisi le lien méthodologique que vous faites entre le texte biblique et le récit de mozambicain. Méthodologiquement, je n'ai pas saisi le rapport. Si vous pouvez expliquer un peu. Et puis, deuxièmement, est-ce que il suffit de repérer des éléments de la nature dans un récit biblique ou dans un autre récit pour dire qu'il y a écologie? Merci.
Votre voisin, oui.
Thank you very much, Professor
Pedro.
Pedro. Thank you for your wonderful presentation and highlighting the orality in your choosing text and vis-a-vis your Makwa storytelling. I was a kind of thrill, maybe you want to put this question on the footnote. Among all the evangelists, I mean, many of us here, we all know that Mark was a kind of a poor grammarian compared to Luke. All the evangelists, if you read the text, Kai Genito and all that, Luke was not only a good historian, but also a good writer and a physician. I was kind of surprised. Is there any reason why you went to Mark and not to pick Luke? As you had argued earlier, it's not what you say, but how you say it. So among the evangelists, definitely Luke would have always been a good writer and a good storyteller. Secondly, in the story, you pointed out the imperative, and that began that verse 3. I'm sure you must have noticed also the chiasm, the chiastic nature of that verse 9. The infinitive there, akuen, and then akueto. I don't know what you had to do with that, the effect, the force of that in terms of story telling. My also distinguished colleagues here have pointed out that apart from this oral, structural narrative, what is the theology of the text? Most commentators and theologians, in fact, and ecologists can see that the parable is not just a parable of the seed, but the parable is often called a parable of the soil. Could also be as a parable of the soil, because the problem wouldn't have just been the seed, but the poor soil. And if I were you, that would have actually been my point of departure in terms of ecology, how we abuse the soil, what we do with the soil, because the seed fell on wrong soil, not just because of the carelessness of the sower. Thank you very much.
Les deux derniers intervenants, professeur Manus et professeur Porberet.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I thank you to Pedro. Pedro, I commend you for what you have done. It belongs to a movement I, in particular, and some others have been championing, the intercultural approach to reading biblical texts. Here is a good example, I want to say. My good members of the APECA have not been noticing what elsewhere we are doing called intercultural exegesis of texts. And SNTS and some other organizations are accepting and welcoming Africans who are giving insight into the reading of biblical texts through the intercultural analysis of text. That's very important. You have done it here, but you don't know the term. You didn't use intercultural, that and that, or hermeneutics. I have the book, Intercultural Hermeneutics, in the Bible. Have you seen it? Done by Acton Publishers, Nairobi. Two, I want to draw attention. You couldn't have done this work unless you are far away from Mundele, Albert, and Nkole, and etc. Who have just published a book, The Bible and Orality in Africa. And a number of us have made contributions in that work that have been very helpful to deal with this story telling. Oh, you saw it. You are defending myself. I'm glad. In any case, I recommend your work. I would like to have a full text that closely read it, and then give it another reshaping, intercultural analysis. Oh, is it there? I've not seen it.
Dernier intervenant, professeur Porberet, au fond.
Alors, Pedro, merci bien for your contribution. You started with verse 3. You should have put us in context. He began to teach by the sea. You know, the sea is just next door. Pedro. So the context is the right one. Now, my question is this. It begins with akuete, and at the end it says akuen, akueto. So it is hearing, listening. Well, you know, because we have already discussed a bit at the beginning, at table. Now, the audience is an oral AU audience. It's clear. There is something strange in your text. You have 3 cases where the result is 0. First, you have what? A path. And the result of the sowing is 0. Second, you have a rocky ground. And the result is 0. Third, you have thorns. And the result is 0. Now comes the 4th case, the good soil. And there you have 3 results, 30, 60, and 100. What do you think your writer, Mark, is expecting his oral audience to get from these cases? Thank you.
Merci, Père Béret. Maintenant, Pedro, à vous la parole. Essayez de nous faire une synthèse comme réponse à toutes ces questions et observations. Merci.
Thank you for the observations. Yes, there are similarities between Makua and the Mark text. In fact, in my paper, they are there. I found some similarities, not only in terms of rhetoric and strategies of persuasion, but also the theme. But I realized that the Makua story emphasized more on the ecological importance, on the ecological theme, more than Mark, because in Mark it seems that the natural elements are there, but in a metaphorical effect, most probably. And then concerning the balance between Makua and why the analysis I did of the Makua story is more than Mark's, in a way, because I have mentioned in my paper that in Mark I would highlight only 4 features of rhetoric, and it is a written text. While a Makua text, I recorded it. I have more elements. It's recorded. I saw the old man when he was speaking. I could see the gestures. So I think that's the point. That's the imbalance there. But it's not because the Makua is more important. No, it's just because of the context of the material. Something is a written material that I have to try to squeeze out some oral elements from a written text. In other contexts, is I have the oral elements there, fresh. And then concerning connection on methodology, the approach is only the oral features. I think you are the one who asked. I mean, I highlighted oral features from Mark and oral features from the Makua. And I said in the beginning that I would just say the orality, the strategies of persuasion, and the ecology, the presence or concentration of natural elements. These both, I was a bit clear in my paper. Only these 2 aspects: the strategies of persuasion and the oral and the natural elements. That's all, yeah. And both. No, but anyway, okay, I get you. That mean I miss the kind that I would have compared both. But in fact, it was not my aim. Yeah, I could deepen that possibility, but I don't consider it really relevant for what I want to arrive at, eco-preaching. Because when I explain what eco-preaching is, then I try to use both Mark's elements and the Makua elements. I don't need to compare and say which is better. Or no, it's a kind of two contexts that enrich each other in this case here. It's not kind of valuing what is better. That was not my aim. And then I still have some time for the other questions. There were too many, so I'm not. So, is it enough to the occurrence of an element from nature in a text to qualify it as an ecological text? For me, yes. From my perspective, yes. It's just a matter of, I defined ecology in my paper as the ecological text as a text that has ecological elements, concepts, mindset related to nature. Then we can discuss what is the effect of, or what is the aim of the element that is present there. And what's the meaning? That's another discussion. And then poor grammarian is, whether Mark is poor grammarian, I don't know. From my point of view, there are no poor speaker. Anyway, he's a rhetor. Mark also is a rhetor. He's used rhetoric. I don't know whether I can say he's a poor rhetoric. It could be maybe a poor Greek, if you want. From which perspective? I don't know. From which perspective? I have read people saying that Mark is poorer than Luke. Paul is better than Mark. From which perspective? Because we find strategies of persuasion in Mark too. Also in Mark, there are strategies of persuasion. So how can you say is poor rhetoric is poorer rhetoric than the other one? It's a kind of, anyway, I respect, but I don't, yeah. And then concerning chiasm, I noticed it. I noticed the chiasm there, but from the methodology I chose, I said I would I would deal only with those 4 elements there. It's a kind of methodology, only for those 4 elements, not others. Otherwise, it would be a dissertation, in fact. And then, what is the theology of the text? If it's soil, if it's, I will skip it. Because I began by saying that the theme was not it's not relevant for my paper. It's only the strategies of persuasion. Intercultural exegesis, I think it has been Professor concerning intercultural exegesis, Bible and orality. In fact, I'm humble also. I have an article in that book you are referring to. The context, Akueto, I think, is Professor Paul Beret. I mentioned it, the triple, I said there are 3 soils that they have a negative outcome, and then the second one, the 4th one, that has a positive outcome. And then I said, most probably the speaker wanted the listener to concentrate, to pay more attention on the last on the last soil. In fact, there was, I detected a feature of orality in the fourth soil that I didn't mention before. For the sake of time, there is a feature of orality for the fourth type of soil. Let me revisit here my notes just a moment. For example, the good soil has 10 gain, 10 colon. This the good soil is mentioned with stressed similar endings. I noticed this. Stressed similar endings. 10 gain, 10 colon. While the others, they are not stressed, at least for the voice and the ending. So according to me, the speaker wanted the listener to pay more attention on the last soil.
Merci beaucoup,
Welcome.
Monsieur Pedro. On n'en finira pas, on pourrait même prendre toute la soirée. Je crois qu'il y aurait autant de questions et de réponses. Merci, Sœur Aringo, pour votre apport. Puis je vous prie maintenant de regagner votre place pour céder la place à l'événement qui suit. Et je laisse Moïse l'annoncer. En ce qui me concerne, j'aurai terminé mon travail d'aujourd'hui. Je vous remercie.
Je n'ai même pas. Merci beaucoup, Célestin, pour toute la journée. Ce n'est pas facile. Alors, deux petites informations. On va mettre tout à l'heure ici ce qu'on appelle ça, cette feuille d'information, et ici ce livret. La feuille d'information, c'est pour l'université de Hekima à Nairobi. Ils offrent des bourses gratuites aux religieuses. Et c'est des cours, je crois, en ligne. Donc, pour que soient vos religieuses, si vous voulez, on va leur offrir des cours en théologie et des bourses. Voilà. Alors, on va déposer ça derrière là-bas et vous pouvez vous servir. Ici, pardon? Ça, c'est bon, non? Ah, this is a pamphlet, you can take it. Hekima University College belongs to the Jesuits in Nairobi. They are having online courses for theology, but they are also offering a scholarship for religious sisters. It's only for religious sisters. You apply, and wherever you are in the world, you can assist. Thank you. This one is a booklet entitled Les congrégations religieuses féminines présentes dans le pays depuis 1845. So it is just to have a religious history of a place, of the Mauritius island. So it is free of charge. You just take, if you want to know what are the religious women congregations working in the country. Bon, merci. Et enfin, tout à l'heure, on aura messe immédiatement. J'aurais souhaité que nous nous habillions en aube, en grand, hein? Pour l'aube là. Oui, pour la messe, je sais que c'est facultatif. Donc ceux qui viennent à la messe ce soir, qu'ils mettent leurs aubes au maximum, parce que les journalistes tiennent à nous prendre en photo avec les aubes et pour des raisons de la presse. Merci. So we have mass immediately after the last session. I beg you to come with your vestments, because the journalists, they want to have us vested as good priests who are celebrating the Mass. Okay, thank you. Finally, Mr. Le Breton, he could not talk to us on the first day, but he's here. We want to give him a maximum of 15 minutes to share with us what he has to say. Thank you. It is, you can come to introduce him, please. Patrick, come to introduce him. Good morning. How are you, my brother? Good. Welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you. Viens introduire, viens le présenter. Hein? Okay. Yes. We understand.
Okay, good evening to all. I'm very honored to be here. I'm sorry for not being present on Monday morning. There's just a little confusion in the planning and invitation. So I'm really, really sorry about that. But I'm very pleased now to be among you. Patrick invited me to come over here to talk to you, and eventually, it is I suppose, as an ecological activist, which I am. And with eventually Christian background, which I try to have. And so I think it's the best thing I can tell you this evening. It's about precisely the type of experience of what it means for a Christian to be an ecological activist in some points, and the type of experience, of a spiritual experience I may take out of that, and eventually with the scriptures as well. As I'm not an exeget like you are, I'm not pretending to do a full exegesis here. Just in a few words about me, is that of course I was born and I grew up in a Christian family, and which was with a strong fervor, and and eventually. I went at some point of my life in a seminar, so with a project to be a priest, but I didn't go to the end. I stopped a couple of years before the end. But I think that was a very important moment in my life to become an activist. So this is why I find it's much more a point of spiritual theology than a point of scriptures, but I think the fact is that at that moment I really felt like maybe, you know, in a moment like this, when you decide to change your way and to stop a project in which that was very important to you, and to renunciate to that project, it's a bit like you feel some failure eventually, you feel very much alone, but it's a moment where you have some great spiritual graces as well, and I never felt some much more at that moment, at that very moment, that what it means to be a son of God, a son of a Father. It was not like as if you would be praying in front of a cross like the beloved apostle, but it was much more like praying on the cross, like being crucified with Christ. So it was like and you really feel something like what it means to hear the words, "This is my beloved Son." At that moment, for me, it was very clear that I tasted the sense and the feeling of action in the way Hannah Arendt defines action. It's an action that is very performative in the public sphere. You really feel free to behave in the public sphere as Son of God. It's maybe a very guru kind of speech to say that, but it meant a lot. I think for me, my ecological activism is precisely rooted in that moment in my life. When I left the seminary, I really felt the sense of being Son of God, of Son of a Father. And I often say that my faith is much more Father-centered than Christ-centered. Christ being kind of the way for me. And it's very important because this is where I had the courage, the nerve to act in the public sphere and to take action at some moment. So actually, when I came back from the seminary in France to Mauritius, just at that moment, there was an important conflict that was taking place between NGOs and the government to stop the construction of a highway through one of the two primary forests of the country. And it's important to know that only 2% of the Mauritian territory is still covered with primary forest. So I really felt at ease to get into that fight at that moment. And it's precisely a moment where actually activism developed also my sense for ecology, and ecology moved myself and encouraged myself to get further into that path, into that way. It's not something that was completely defined at the beginning. It's only when you get into it that you develop the knowledge, you develop the know-how. So I realized at that moment what it means when we talk about the fragility of ecosystems and the speed at which it was possible for man to eradicate other forms of life. I integrated into my ethics two important notions of responsibility: the responsibility towards future generations and responsibility towards that which is smaller and more fragile than oneself, even an individual and of another species than the human species. And so this was the first discovering and understanding of the meanings of ecology to me at that moment in 2005. And just shortly after that, a more violent fight was to take place, and it was against a waste incineration project. This may sound like a good idea to many people, but it is not. It had two major drawbacks. First, the residual ashes that would be buried in the soil represented a threat to the country's water tables. And the other major drawback was that the project contractually obliged the Mauritian government to supply their incinerator with a minimum of 400,000 tons of waste per year, or face exorbitant penalties. With such a contract, it became impossible to engage in a policy that would encourage the reduction of waste production. On the contrary, our society was condemned to consume and throw away more and more. We were in a dead end. In this situation, how to get out of this addictive consumer society which produces waste and causes the planetary damages. So, I was myself at that moment the coordinator of a campaign at national level, and we had to organize demonstrations. We were in 2009, and I quickly realized how difficult it was to get massive popular support. In fact, political awareness of Mauritians is very low on everything that has to do with common good, unfortunately, in our country, and this is due to anthropological and social reasons that I'm not going to address here. Still, in this fight, it seemed necessary to me to get closer to trade union platforms. So we found ourselves with a union demonstrating side by side in the streets of the capital, and this experience immediately opened my eyes to the fact that ecological questions could in no way be dissociated from the social question. The two aspects are intrinsically linked. It became an irreducible evidence ecology is above all a political subject. And whatever I may say in the rest of my speech, I want to emphasize that this point seems to me the most important. And the fight against waste incineration was an excellent revelation of this. It brought awareness to how we collectively choose or don't choose to provide for ourselves as a human community. This is not a matter of individual choice or responsibility. More than that, it also raised awareness on how our fellow human beings are exposed to chemical pollution. By incidence, it made us aware of a fundamental right of each human being to have access to a clean and healthy nature. This is obvious since this nature is co-natural to us. Every human being depends on air and water for his or her very existence. It is therefore right to be guaranteed from birth to have access to a free and healthy nature. It is necessary to have a nature that has not been confiscated either in space or time by private interests. And soil pollution is a confiscation of land, it is a confiscation of water, it is a confiscation of air. And here I want to warn against the temptation to reduce ecological question to a moral question or an economic question that would simply aim to make production or consumption patterns more responsible. I will come back on that a little later. In other words, the ecological question must not be reduced to a personalist anthropology aimed at defining a relationship between man and nature. This is why I'm not satisfied with an ecological exegesis based on the story of creation in the book of Genesis. I have a feeling that this account too often tends to feed this perception. Once again, ecology is above all the question of a social fact. It is a question by which humans manage to live together and to remain together, alive, over the very long term. And after that fight against waste incineration, we developed a platform to federate all the NGOs for ecology in Mauritius, and I had the honor to be the spokesperson for that platform of NGOs during 6 years. And it was very interesting to notice the diverse backgrounds of all these NGOs, with all different philosophical baggage and existential aspirations. This shows precisely the political nature of ecology, and it shows, unfortunately, how far away we are from the emergence of a clear and new political framework for our world. I will not tell you today the whole story of the actions led by the Mauritian Platform for Environment that still exists today, but I can tell you that at the heart of these fights, we really measure the devastating madness of our humanity. This madness can be linked to a logic of grabbing. Of course, I am thinking here of a coral island off the coast of Mauritius, which was in a pristine state and which had been given by the Mauritian government to a friend of a prime minister so that he could turn it into a paying destination for tourists. Of course, at no time the environmental issue was addressed, nor the question of greater good for the Mauritian community. This madness can also be linked to a complete inversion of values. For example, in the name of sacrosanct economic development, one can justify all kinds of aberrations. I am thinking here of a coal-fired power plant project with a capacity of 100 megawatts that a private consortium was planning to build with the blessing of a government. Just think about it. In addition to the climatic impacts of all these carbon emissions, this project was to be built in a still preserved area of a Mauritian coastline on top of a splendid and pristine cliffs and close to a residential area. In this type of situation, it is not so much the prospect of a fight to be waged that is frightening, as the staggering impression that common sense has deserted and left us alone. How to dialogue with the authorities when we are obviously in totally different cognitive universe? It is obvious that two radically different perceptions of the world are opposed here. So much so that this situation pushed one of our friends within these NGOs to go on a hunger strike that lasted 19 days. This was precisely to create a shock of consciousness. The most surprising thing about this type of fight is that we, the ecologists, are often accused of having too extreme, too radical behaviors. But then, can you please explain to me what can be more radical than destroying a beautiful site full of life, full of biodiversity, where human communities live peacefully, to put a coal power plant at the top of it. If this is not radical, then what is? This inversion of values, this darkening of consciences, is that no longer allows any discernment, is, I believe, the most tragic thing about what we are experiencing today. I could summon Hannah Arendt again here, especially in her reflections on the origin of evil from the Nazi experience. She concluded that the evil that settled in a community was nothing more than a huge bubble of human stupidity that was commonly shared and that found its origin in a lie accepted by all. And that the ground for this was a world that had become confused without cardinal values. And so for this core PowerPoint, I wonder if it's not like a structure of sin kind of thing that guided this type of reflection. Thanks to this experience acquired in NGO, I also decided after that to launch a pioneering consulting company in Mauritius to assist companies in their ecological transition. In fact, this global ecological crisis crosses all spheres of human affairs. In the corporate world, it is epitomized by the notion of corporate social responsibility. In fact, this concept is not new. It emerged in management school some 60 years ago, but never really gained unanimity until about 20 years or so. Frankly, this managerial ethic neither questions the economic model in which our planet has been evolving for the last 4 centuries, nor does it question the entrepreneurial model itself. To put it in a simplistic manner, companies tend to see nature as an infinite and worthless resource that anyone can take and degrade as they please. It is only when the company gets its hands on these natural resources that they suddenly take on a financial value. Before that, this exceptional wealth does not appear anywhere in the economy or in the public accounts. And I can tell you that when you are debating with foolish economic development fanatics, this kind of information would have been very useful to make them see reason. The fact remains that the environmental impacts of companies, which are now called negative externalities, have started to become more and more significant over time. You are already aware of the scale of the disaster, the accumulation of carbon dioxide that changes the climate regime of the planet, the collapse of all forms of life on Earth that has become chronic now, and the presence of pollution everywhere. Of course, production and consumption patterns are directly at fault, but the cost of this disaster has never been imputed to companies, whereas it has always been borne by human communities. This means that it is always the poorest or most fragile who pay the consequences. Today, these externalities are better assessed and considered by companies with the aim of successfully internalizing their cost. This is where we see an evolution in management ethics. In this field, there are 2 philosophical currents that have been confronting each other for 60 years. The first is rooted in the principle of entrepreneurial freedom and establishes the responsibility of a company at the level of a decision maker, in his or her personal relationship to good and evil. The other is rooted in the principle of citizenship of any legal body and their accountability for all decisions that can affect the community. Obviously, I am more comfortable with the second approach, since ecology is gregarious in nature and cannot be reduced to a personalizing ontology. Alongside this management ethic, ecological issues are also entering the business world through the prism of risk management. With a depletion of natural resources and the increase of disasters, companies also realize that their future is at stake and that they need to better anticipate. And as the shrewd manager says in Luke 16, when he finds himself up against the wall, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job." In other words, what shall I do when my future is ruined? Well, we all know what he does, since he buys back the debt of the debtors. In a way, CSR is a bit like that. Companies measure the amount of risk they face if all the predicted disasters were to occur. And since the future is constrained, then they try to find ways out, sometimes with innovating intelligently. Sometimes they innovate intelligently, and sometimes they fictiously redeem themselves through storytelling. Unfortunately, we must not forget that this pericope also concludes with this pithy sentence: for the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. All this CSR is still insufficient to solve the ecological challenges of our time. At this rate, our planet will be like a patient who has died once cured. And of course, I'm not satisfied with this situation. And others face the same dilemma in this business world. So much so that some companies are trying to revolutionize the business model from within and are making even more radical commitments. They are called benefit corporations. It's a type of company whose mission is to serve the social and environmental betterment of the planet. So this company exists primarily for the greater good rather than for profit. There is an international certification to recognize them. It is a B Corp label. I couldn't resist to the temptation to have my company certified as a B Corp. Actually, we are the first certified consultant in French-speaking Africa, and I was recently talking to the headquarter team who are responsible for managing this label in Africa, and they are based in Kenya. And they were pointing out to me that the label in Africa is working well with companies from a Western culture, but the certification had more difficulty in attracting the interest of specifically African companies. And we agreed that the important thing was not the certification itself, but to encourage African companies to invent new models that suited them. This is typically the spirit of an ecological approach, I believe. How can diversity listen to each other? How can we leave room for the emergence of otherness without being affected by it? Environmental activism through business is today the ultimate format of my journey. For example, 2 years ago, the country was shocked to discover that a huge cargo ship, the Wakasho, had sunk on the coral reef. This resulted in the largest oil spill we ever had, and precisely in what is probably the most beautiful marine park on our island. This shock was a turning point in the consciousness of the Mauritians and led to what was probably the largest citizen mobilization in Mauritius. The authorities mismanaged the situation, and worst of all, they did not disclose any information related to pollution, fish contamination, and public health. At that time, we were coming out of 3 months of strict confinement because of COVID. Low-income families were in a great financial distress, and now the local fishermen were banned from fishing. In return, they were given a symbolic and clearly insufficient financial compensation. Faced with such an omission on the part of the authorities, we decided to make use of the company's expertise to prepare a report on the socio-economic impacts of the oil spill. We compiled statistics and interviewed 800 people voluntarily. We then published the report online and for free. The aim was that all citizens could be respected and treated as adults in the face of this disaster. From a scientific point of view, this study was also very instructive. It confirmed that it confirmed in Mauritius, or for Mauritius, what predictive models already say at international level. We discovered that the poorest people are also the most fragile, meaning the least resilient and the least autonomous in the face of a natural disaster. The issue is important because we know that with climate change, natural disasters will be more frequent and more important in the future. In the specific case of the Wakasho disaster, we first observed that the closure of all economic activities during the COVID forced modest families to develop survival strategies thanks to the natural resources available, especially marine resources available in the lagoon. Some families went into a little debt, but reasonably so. But 3 months after, with the Wakasho's shipwreck, with the oil spill and the closure of all access to the sea, Poor families lost all flexibility. They were no longer resilient. Some became over-indebted. Others sold their productive capital, such as their motorcycles, to get to work, or their boat engines. They had thus restarted the vicious circle that will lead them into extreme poverty. In the face of a coming climate change, it is therefore vital to allow everyone to have free access to quality natural resources. So when I look to the biblical text from my perspective as an environmentalist, I am left rather perplexed. The biblical offer is, as on all ethical and political matters, very composite or very poor. I will pick out a few random elements. To begin simplistically, many biblical offers practicing immanent justice appears to be rather consistent in inflicting natural disaster as punishment for human injustice. Political disorder and social injustice have an effect on nature, which then turns against human beings. It is basic, but in today's world it works, unfortunately. And it is even more ironic that until about 30 years ago, thinking that nature could impose itself as a punishment for the excesses of human society was still considered by science to be magical thinking. And Noah with his ark appeared to be the first conservationist of biodiversity. In the end, what better promise of life, what better promise about a future can God make to Noah's descendants than to offer them a preserved biodiversity? So divine punishment does take this into account. But not only a punishment. In this Bible, in Bible, nature is in turn the demonstration of God's abundant providence towards mankind, whether it is in the manna in the desert or the promised land full of milk and honey. The proof of the power and glory of a clever creator, as we see much in the book of Psalms. The world of idols, and therefore a dead end to be wary of, like in the book of Wisdom, where I can quote the phrase, "For all people who were ignorant of God were foolish by nature, and they were unable from the good things that are seen to know the one who exists, nor did they recognize the artisan while paying heed to his works. But they supposed that either fire or wind or swift air or the circle of the stars or turbulent water or the luminaries of heaven were the gods that rule the world." So, but in my opinion, all these texts give clues. They help to outline the ecological question. They may say what not to do, but at this stage, and I hope you will prove me wrong, I do not see in the biblical content a very clear corpus capable of accounting for human communities and their good life in an organic and integrated way with the whole of creation. As I said, ecology is above all political. It implies a relationship of interdependence between all parts of a system, and all choices must be made in a way that favors the autonomy and resilience of the said system. Perhaps the fact that nature is so quick to give us in abundance or to punish us according to our good or bad behavior is enough to demonstrate the organic link between man and between the human beings and creation. But probably the passage that best captures a certain political ecology would be in the Gospel of Matthew. Look at the birds of the air, they do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? The exegetical answer to the ecological question seems unsolvable from the start. The whole biblical narrative, it seems to me, is oriented on the call of a people, Jewish or Christian. It is about its election, that is to say about its singularization out of its original condition and in virtue of a finality established in God. How then can we find the way to resituate the human community within a creation in which all created things are interdependent? Unless this call of God that makes us his sons and daughters is extended to all creation. Just as St. Paul extended the gospel to the nations 2,000 years ago, should we extend the gospel to all creation today? And why not? The song of the three children in Daniel 3 inspires us. And you mountains and hills, oh bless the Lord, and you all plants of the earth, oh bless the Lord, and you fountains and springs, oh bless the Lord. To him be highest glory and praise forever. And who are we to stop the creation to bless the Lord? I don't know if you have an exegesis answer to that. So that's it.
Merci beaucoup, Thierry. Tu as bien dit que tu es un activiste. Hein, tu n'es pas quelqu'un qui fait seulement des études de la Bible pour savoir ce que c'est que l'écologie et comment la Bible nous parle de l'écologie, mais tu es un activiste et tu nous as montré ton évolution dans cette question et tu es devenu activiste en faisant. C'est quand tu as pris position concernant une route qui devrait être bâtie que tu as compris que c'était ton combat. Et c'est un combat qui a évolué et surtout tu nous montres comment tu es arrivé à former ta propre compagnie et que tu es en contact avec l'Afrique et que tu as eu ton siège. Le siège est au Kenya, tu as été au Kenya.
Ouais.
Hein, et que donc là, ce qui est exactement ce que nous faisons, nous sommes en lien avec l'Afrique et donc tu essayes de dire comment ça peut avancer dans la question de l'écologie. Mais surtout, tu as découvert que l'écologie, c'est une question sociale, c'est une question politique, c'est une question d'interdépendance et que c'est un long combat. Et ce que tu demandes, c'est que à la fois les gens ne sont pas très conscients hein, que c'est un combat, il faut parler. Tu dis tu es the spokesman, the spokesperson of the group, il faut parler. Mais en t'écoutant, tu trouves dans la Bible des éléments qui te ressourcent pour mener ce combat. Alors c'est un peu ce que j'ai entendu quand tu as parlé, et je crois que nous avons apprécié. We appreciate this activist, not only someone who thinks, but an activist. Are you having a question? A question? Something? Okay. So thank you very much, Thierry.
Merci.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The way I see your faces, you are really very tired. So I suggest, if you don't mind, that we don't have our business meeting today, and we have it tomorrow. Okay? Well, at the same time, we'll be back. That one will be easier than today. At